Right, welcome to the 2023 Belgian Grand Prix, the pre-race analysis. We're going to go through qualifying, we'll go through the sprint shootout, and then briefly talk about the sprint race, which there's not so much to say about that. So some of the key points that I'm going to dig through this on from a data point of view is, first of all, chaotic wet dry sessions. I absolutely love these sessions in qualifying and races, and they make it super interesting, which otherwise would be quite predictable. In qualifying, Verstappen had a massive pole margin, absolutely insane. And then in the sprint shootout, we had the most minuscule margins for pole in similar conditions, slightly worse. And I'll elaborate on why that was interesting later. Also, the sprint race was pretty chaos, and the sprint qualifying was even chaotic. We had some interesting discussions between Verstappen and his race engineer GP, which were fairly humorous, but we can look at that and see what happened. And then we could talk about what could have been for Hamilton in the sprint shootout or the sprint qualifying, because a lot of people, including Toto Wolff, said he could have been on pole. So I was like, okay, that sounds possible, but how possible was it? So with some degree of uncertainty, we can look at that, and you guys can make up your own decision on that. And then we'll talk about the sprint race. We'll talk about the incident between Perez and Hamilton, and we'll get your opinions on this. And if you're watching this later on YouTube, we do these live an hour before every Grand Prix over on twitch.tv/break with 3 R's. And also YouTube, thank you guys for 100,000 subscribers on Break F1. Just over a year since we started posting long form content, and thank you guys very much. But let's get into it. So as I said before, another awesome qualifying session with wet to dry chaos. My favorite. People get caught out, people get in trouble, people miss things. Verstappen topped the session by about 0.8%, which is the biggest margin Red Bull have had on pole this season. If you want to see what that looks like, this is what that looks like. So here's the gaps to pole for every race, and you can see the bottom line, 0% is Red Bull. In Hungary, we had Mercedes barely on pole, matching the Red Bull's performance, and McLaren getting close. But look at this, the Belgian Grand Prix proper qualifying session, their gap to pole was 0.8%, just about, to Ferrari. That is the biggest gap to pole since, arguably, Williams. That's the fastest lap time in Q2 there. But yeah, I mean, this is huge. And like, honestly, I don't think this is a normal circumstance. I think that was a bit of track evolution, and Max absolutely nailing that. Another thing that we noticed during that session, Mercedes were taking a leaf out of what Red Bull have been doing quite a bit recently, giving up on the track evolution and going out earlier in the session in order to get a clean lap. And then foreshadowing a little bit to the sprint qualifying, track position is so important, and we'll come back to that. Another thing about track position and timing being important in these sessions, Hulkenberg misses the opportunity to put in another fast lap in Q1, and he's sent out and he crosses the line after the checker just dropped when he was about to start his second lap. So Hulkenberg knocked out in Q1. Ricciardo did miss out on Q2 as he got his lap time deleted for crossing the apex curb at the top of Radion at turn 4. And we'll talk about that upset about Verstappen nearly getting eliminated in Q2, and we'll have a look at that in a second. So here are the lap times from the qualifying session. This is the normal qualifying session. I'll put my camera up here. You don't really need to see the margin. So here's the start of Q1. Here's everybody out on inters, and the track's ramping up. Track is ramping up. They go out again at the end of Q1, and they're still on inters, but they're getting close to where the crossover time is. And if you look, you want to know what the crossover time is? Take the fastest dry time of the weekend and multiply that by 1.15. So 115% around there is usually kind of like the wet dry crossover, as long as there's not standing puddles of the water. Around Spa, there was a dry line forming on the track, so everything was pretty good. And then you can see here, everybody puts on the softs at the end of Q2. The track is just getting fast. I mean, the first lap, everybody's taking a lot of margin. They go fast, and faster. And Verstappen almost doesn't make it through this session. Finally, in Q3, you can see everybody goes out on softs again. And then look at this gap that Verstappen has here, everybody else in Q3. So that's just like, that's visually looking at the session. In terms of gaps to pole, here's the gaps to pole. This chart's a little bit scuffed because I wasn't expecting anybody to be 12% off, but that's what happens when you have people going out in Q1. But realistically, if we focus on this, these are the gaps to pole in the soft, and the track was getting so much faster. This pole time in the proper qualifying session was still 3 seconds off of last year's qualifying time. So Verstappen, about 1% ahead of Ferrari, Hamilton, Piastri, and Alonso. Aston Martin not looking particularly impressive lately, and it's like since they've started adding some of their upgrades, just kind of going downhill. But if you're enjoying this kind of analysis, again, we do this live on Twitch an hour before every Grand Prix. We'll watch qualifying and race every week on twitch.tv/break. And so be sure to check out. And if you're not following the channel, subscribe to the channel, you should do that now. And if you want to learn more about this and this kind of data, you're like, okay, this is cool stuff we're about to get into. If you're in the Twitch stream, type *data, or if you're in the YouTube, check the Buy Me a Coffee link at the top of the description. And this is just a sample of what's going on. We'll get into it in a lot more detail. But let's just have a quick look at Verstappen versus Leclerc. So those are the top 2 fastest teams in qualifying, the proper qualifying session. And my camera's in a little bit awkward place, so I'm just going to shrink it. You can barely see me. So this is Verstappen versus Leclerc in Q3. And I'll go through this quickly for anybody that's new. And then for the rest of them, we'll kind of rip through them. So the top chart is the car speed. You can see here I've labeled all the corners. So here's turn 1, here's turn 2, here's turn 5, 6, and 7, turn 8 and 9. So that makes it easy for us to refer to it. Here's the throttle trace. You can see when the drivers are on throttle and off throttle. Here's the DRS on and off, and here's the lap time difference. When this chart goes above 0, you can see it says Verstappen's ahead, and by the end of the lap, Verstappen is about 0.8 seconds ahead of Leclerc. So if we talk about the main differences that I see, and this is how I usually break it down. I go by segments. I'll look at the high speed, I'll look at the straight line, I'll look at the medium speed and low speed, and try to say, is it traction, everything else? We can try to pick up build a bit of a picture of what's good or bad about the car and driver combination, because it's difficult to separate the two. So the first thing we notice here is that Ferrari and Red Bull are very similar straight line. Ferrari have a little bit more speed through turn 2, 3, 4, and then at the end of the straight, Red Bull pick up a bit of speed. I can't tell if Leclerc maybe had a bit of a toe as he was coming through someone, but in general, the Ferrari looked a little bit slippier in terms of, the average top speed. In terms of peak speed, the Red Bull's quite a bit faster. But in this session, Verstappen finds a quarter of a second through turn 5, 6, 7. And this is where Verstappen found huge chunks of lap time over pretty much everybody in this session, is turn 9. I mean, he's looking at 15 kilometers an hour faster through turn 9. So that's the fast left-hander. Turn 10, 11, not much in it. He gives up a little bit of time on the entry to 12, but has a huge drive out of 13 and then gains time through 14. Not much exactly in the bus stop final chicane. Now, if we look at Verstappen versus Hamilton, I think this is another interesting one to look at. So turn 1, Verstappen finds a lot of time on the brakes. Max is literally a quarter of a second up on Lewis in the brakes. You can also see that Lewis is running quite a bit less downforce, or he has a toe. So it looks like the Red Bull's DRS is still quite powerful here. So looking at this part of the track, here's Verstappen's top speed going through out of the top of Eau Rouge. And here's Hamilton's speed. And then once they hit the DRS, Verstappen carries on a bit more speed. And you also notice the Mercedes have a little bit of clipping at the end of straight. You can see how while they're still full throttle, the car speed drops. That means that Red Bull has a little bit more energy deployment available around the lap. So difference in power units and the strategies. But yeah. Max finds half a second through 5, 6, 7. Lewis actually very strong through turn 9. Lewis doesn't lose much here. So Leclerc probably left quite a bit on the table on turn 9. A lot of the big downforce corner, Verstappen finding a lot of pace through turn 10, but it's really not worth that much lap time. And again, Max getting a good drive and a good exit through 14. And then without the DRS, Hamilton gaining a little bit on the straight. So one of the things we can tell this weekend is the Mercedes opting to go for a little bit less downforce because it's a long circuit, nearly 7 kilometers. And top speed is important as well as cornering speed. But that's interesting to me because this weekend is going to be mostly wet. And I don't think anybody could predict quite with any certainty that Sunday would be dry. And last I checked Sunday, today's Grand Prix looks like it's going to be dry. So maybe Mercedes have thought about that and said, you know what, well, we're going to risk it. We're not going to put a shitload of downforce and drag on the car. We need to be competitive in top speed because the overtake opportunities will come in a straight line down to turn 5, possibly down to turn 1. And, and we saw some other interesting overtaking spots yesterday, which we'll talk about from the sprint race. So really, like the Mercedes have had a different plan this weekend, and their top speed without DRS is quite a bit different. But I think everybody's been talking about Oscar Piastri, and let's look at his qualifying performance on Friday. And this one's pretty interesting. Put my little tiny baby camera back up at the top. So Verstappen, let's look first broad strokes of this. Verstappen absolutely so much faster in terms of top speed. We're talking 10 kilometers an hour faster without DRS here, up to 15 kilometers an hour with DRS, and the McLaren also clipping quite a bit. You can see their car speed drops here. So the way that works is you deploy energy out of your battery as soon as you can. And at the end of the straight, when the drag is so high and your top speed isn't changing that much, you don't really get that much back. So that's why you see them clipping at the end of the straight rather than saying like, oh, let me save battery and deploy it out of Eau Rouge. No, that's not a fast way to go. So if we look at Piastri's lap, Max is much faster through turn 1, and he's literally 3/4 of a second up on Piastri by the time he breaks for turn 5. Now, Piastri is very good through turn 5, 6, 7. You can see 5, 6, 7 is this. Sorry for that notification. Oops. Turn 5, 6, 7 is one of those corners where you go in 5 is the right-hander into 6, and you really want to carry speed through all of that. So you're building up through the whole thing, and you can see that. So Max having to check up a little bit in turn 7. Piastri actually faster than Max through 5, 6, 7, and about the same through turn 8, 9. Now, at the end of straight, through the high-speed corners, you can tell the McLaren has a lot of downforce on the car in 2 ways. Their top speeds are slow, and their high-speed cornering speeds are high. So turn 10, 11, not much in it. Verstappen and Piastri, similar speeds. Piastri very strong through turn 12 and through turn 13, as well as turn 14. And then Max gaining time on the final straight, and then not much really into the final chicane there. So what do we got next? Do you guys want to see how much different the track looks between intermediates versus soft in terms of lap times? And there's some pretty interesting trends that come out of that, actually. So this is red is on the soft at the end of the session, and blue is the inter at the start of the session. But look at this, like, you know, in terms of overall where the lap time is coming from in Spa, all the lap time when you increase the grip is in this middle sector here. So sector 2 is from before turn 5, 6, 7 until I believe turn 13. So I mean, this is sector 2. This is where all the lap time is. And another interesting thing is, look how much time you gain through these low speed corners by having this much delta. I mean, this is 20, 30, 40 kilometers an hour here, and that's worth, you know, 2 seconds. But that much, double that difference through the high speed corner is really only a couple of seconds, or a second difference. So it's not that big. And that's one of those things, like, it's kind of, it goes back to the point where downforce is good to a point, but downforce finds you the most performance in medium and low speed, even though the downforce is tiny at low speeds. So just a quick one. If you guys are enjoying this, I do publish these detailed reports on my Buy Me a Coffee. So if you're on YouTube, there's a link below. And then there is a link in the Twitch stream there. So the point of comparing those two is just to show you how much faster the track is and where all the lap time comes from. It's not really so much in the high-speed corners. Like if we go back and look at that, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a second in turn 1, but all the speed is in these medium-speed corners where you have the good combination of grip and downforce. In the high speed, there's not really that much in it, despite there being that much difference. So it's just a interesting exercise. It's not really that important to compare these different conditions, but it just shows you around a circuit like this where all the lap time comes from. And this is super important in just a minute when we get back to talking about it. Sprint qualifying was interesting. Let's move on to the sprint qualifying. The DRS was disabled throughout the session, and this resulted in a small shakeup in the order. Remember, there were cars that were faster in a straight line than Red Bull, but with the DRS off, the Red Bull took some advantage. So Hülkenberg again gets knocked out in the first session because his engineers decided to abort him off an intermediate to put on a new set of inters because the tire was too hot. So he doesn't set a lap time on the first run. The tires are too hot. He boxes and does not set a lap time. Sam Collins suggested that was their chief race engineer that overrode and said, you need to box because these tires are too hot. And even Hülkenberg was like, you have to put a banker in. You have to put a banker in. So them getting knocked out was a huge operational blunder. We also had a little bit of a tangle between Russell and Hamilton, and a lot of people were really up in arms about that. And let's look at it. We'll talk about that in just a second. And there was a huge track evolution between the first and second sprint qualifying session, with a long red flag caused by Stroll crashing as he decided to go out early on a medium and risk it. And to me, I don't understand the risk to get into Q3. Like, maybe do that if it's still those conditions in the third session, but in the second session, you just need a good lap. And there was, you know, he just went slightly off of the dry line. Yeah, so I'm not too sure about that. And if you're in chat, don't worry, I'll come back to chat in a minute. So the most important, let's look at the results quickly for this. Here are the results from sprint qualifying. Verstappen, look at that, 49.056. Piastri, 49.067. Sainz, 49.081. The top three are within a couple of hundreds. Leclerc is 0.2 off of that. Norris, another 10th behind that. Gasly, and then Hamilton of 49.9, so 9/10 off a pole. And one thing that we did see is Toto Wolff said that Hamilton could have been on pole if it weren't for that little tangle with Russell and compromising the lap. And I was like, okay, I think that could be plausible, but let's look at it. Let's have a look at that data. So we'll come back to that in just a minute. But I think, first of all, we need to put some respect on Mr. Piastri this weekend. He's been absolutely smashing it. So we're going to go back through this telemetry like we did before, and I think you'll find this quite interesting. And I pushed the wrong button. There we go. I'm going to go back to this one. So Verstappen in blue, Piastri in red. You can see the first thing we notice. Now, the DRS says it's on, but the DRS is off for both drivers. Now, without DRS, the Red Bull is still faster in a straight line. The Red Bull has less drag than the McLaren this weekend. We know that. In terms of turn one, Verstappen gains a little bit of time. Verstappen's been quite good about rolling in the brakes and getting a good exit out of turn one. He carries that speed all the way through turn 2, 3, 4, all the way down to turn 5. And then we get to turn 5, and Piastri is matching Verstappen. Verstappen is a nice strong move onto the brakes, but then we get into turn 8 and 9, and Piastri claws back a quarter of a second. We go through the high speed turn 10 into turn 11. Piastri finds another 0.2 of a second. At this point, out of the exit of turn 10, 11, Piastri and Verstappen have the exact same lap time. Now, we go into turn 12 and 13. Piastri is over 10 kilometers an hour faster through both of these sections. Turn 14, they're same. Like, look at this huge difference. Piastri able to get on the throttle, rotate the car between here. Piastri at this point, exiting turn 14, Piastri is a quarter of a second up, 0.25 ahead of Verstappen. Now, this is a long drag of twisty straight line. It's not really straight, but it's full throttle. Verstappen is within 100th braking for the bus stop, and Verstappen has a great drive earlier on throttle, better exit out of that, and he comes up 11 thousandths ahead of Oscar Piastri. So in terms of downforce, in terms of grip, and in terms of balance, the McLaren looks really strong. And I've got a video coming out next week on my main channel about McLaren's evolution from the start of the season, from barely getting any points ever to consistently challenging for podiums. And I think it takes this concept of looking at a lap of data and expands massively. So that video will be out on YouTube this week, and I'll give you guys the biggest breakdown on the Buy Me a Coffee that you've ever seen. So check that out. Another honorable mention is Pierre Gasly. What a dude. What a dude. Actually, funny enough, Pierre Gasly, I posted my plaque, photo with my plaque on my Instagram, on my personal Instagram that I don't share with you guys. And Gasly, liked by Pierre Gasly. I was like, that's really sweet, dude. What a dude. Let's break down Verstappen in blue, Gasly in red. In terms of top speed, Alpine also electing for a lower downforce setup similar to that of McLaren. But braking for turn 1, Verstappen, there's a little issue with the data, but Verstappen's basically 0.3 of a second up here. Gasly claws back some of that by turn 5, 6, 7. Gasly looks like he has a little bit of struggle through 6 and 7. And then Gasly, huge, absolutely, just, so far Gasly's looking a little bit weak through 5, 6, 7. I think Gasly absolutely nails the line through turn 9 to claw back nearly 0.4 of a second, neck and neck through turn 10. Verstappen then claws back a bit of time, exiting apex to exit at 12. He gets a better drive out of 14. And then Max also getting a very strong drive out of the final chicane. Gasly braking quite late and possibly compromising his line there. But yeah, but turn 9 is a super tricky question. The margins are so small here. So very, very interesting approach from Gasly. Gasly making up a lot of time there. Let's talk now. What do we got? We've got 25 minutes before the race. Let's talk about Russell versus Hamilton in sprint qualifying. Sprint qualifying, round 3, the third run and the third session of sprint qualifying. You only have enough time to do one set of tires, fast, slow, fast, right? So you do outlap, push lap, cool the tires, recharge the battery, and then push again. Unfortunately, Sterling, can you offer some advice on this section? This is my cat, Sterling. So Hamilton and Russell were basically backed up at the bus stop on their second push lap, and Hamilton basically released himself or pushed, I think, quite early, but I don't think he wanted to slow down any more than that. So Sterling's just admiring the 100,000 subscriber plaque. Thank you, buddy. So they're released basically within a couple seconds of each other, and Russell misses turn 1 and goes off, and Hamilton has to back out a bit. But then Russell does give him a nice little toe down, and Russell doesn't back out. And the first thing people said was, why didn't Russell back out? If you're a driver, you're probably chasing your lap time delta, and I reckon Russell wasn't entirely sure that his lap was screwed until he got through Eau Rouge anyway. And if he backs out of that because he didn't get it, that's, yeah. I feel like Russell bozoed it, but I don't think he did anything massively wrong. I think he's there to qualify for himself and his team. If his teammate happens to be just behind him, I think they probably could have done with a little bit more gap. I think they had margin. But Toto Wolff said Lewis would have been on pole. So let's look at the data. Why didn't Russell back out? We've already talked about that. So let's look at something, and I'll put this reference to Verstappen because Verstappen was on pole, and I think this is a fair comparison, not because I just picked Verstappen just because. So here is turn 1. Verstappen in blue, Hamilton in red. Hamilton faster down to turn 1 because they have less drag on the car, but Hamilton loses probably 3.5 tenths to Verstappen here because of checking up to not run into George, but then he gains all this time back for turn 5. Now, arguably, driving offline would have hindered his tire temperature slightly, but I'm not sure that was a major player, but we can't say for sure, so we have to keep that in mind. And honestly, when Toto said that, as Andreas says in the chat, I don't think Toto had probably seen all this information, and he's just kind of looking at track evolution. And that's a really interesting thing to talk about, is the track evolution, because that explains a lot. So surely Hamilton losing out 4 tenths at turn 1. Realistically, Hamilton lost out a tenth from turn 1. But what about the evolution there? Let's look at Verstappen, Hamilton, and Piastri's sector times, and I think this will make a little bit more sense of it. And again, we don't really know what was possible, but all I can say is here's what I see, and if how close was he, and use a little bit of extrapolation. We're never going to tell. Like, we're never going to get to redo that session. So to some extent, it's a pointless exercise, but I think it's an interesting conversation to break down what it looks like. So start with Verstappen. Verstappen's sector 1 evolution was about 3 tenths of a second. His sector 2 evolution was nearly 2 seconds, and his sector 3 evolution was 1/10 of a second from first to second push lap. Hamilton, his first sector, he loses a tenth. Okay, his middle sector, he really only gains about 1.4 seconds. That's not crazy, but it's not as much as the others. So Verstappen was 1.7 seconds. Piastri's second sector, he improved a shitload. To be fair, Piastri was the slowest sector 2, so Piastri had quite a bit on the board. And then the third sector, they didn't get a lot. All this to say, if I rewind this slightly to say, there is not that much track evolution in sector 1 and sector 3. All of the track evolution comes in sector 2, and that's why I showed you the enter to dry lap earlier, just to exaggerate that. But if you go back and look at this here, and here's my notes. Right, here's sector 1. Sector 1 is 1 corner. Sector 2 is the bus stop. That's it. So I think that explains it. And this is the question. Like, the big question is, did Hamilton lose so much time in sector 2 from poor preparation? We can't say for sure. But looking back to qualifying on Friday, I don't think there was that much more performance in the car. I mean, this is a damp, wet, dry track, right? And Mercedes are on a low downforce setup, and we're comparing that to Piastri, who's been shit hot on a high downforce setup, and Verstappen, who's on a high-ish downforce setup, who's also been shit hot in sector 2 all weekend. I just don't feel like there was anything in there. Somebody in chat pointed, Andreas in chat pointed this out. This is an interesting thing. So what's this? So this is actually, if you look at it, this is how much time Hamilton gains. So he loses out 4 tenths, and he gains time in the toe. And by the end of this, he's tied with Verstappen by turn 5. At best, he could have been a tenth faster here, to get improvement on that lap. But this is him slipstreaming him into Eau Rouge. He backs out of the throttle, and this is him pulling up right up to Russell and then lifting out of the throttle again before overtaking him offline, which probably hurt his sector 2 a little bit. But what can we say about that? Honestly, I think it was an operational mistake. They should have had a bigger gap between their cars, honestly. But it happens. It's a tricky session. You've got timings. You don't want to miss the lap. So I think it was just one of those things that happened. And if we go back and look at this, I mean, these are the sector. This is the splits at the top. We're talking about a couple of 100 seconds on top 3. Did Hamilton have 9 tenths in that lap? I don't think so. And I think Mercedes are usually quite good operationally, so I'm not really sure about that. And we're picking apart the super tiny things. I don't even know if Lewis was that pissed off, and I can't speak for him. But like, it was just one of those things. You start a lap like that, and yeah, it did cost him a couple grid slots for the sprint, which he was quite eager to make up and made some pretty strong moves. So here's my notes on the sprint race before we get into the race watch along over on Twitch. The wet tires are useless. And Mario Isola said they're basically useless if we aren't going to run them other than behind the safety car, which I'm not going to disagree with him. They are pretty useless. But I think the second part of that discussion is the fact that these tires generate so much spray, and visibility seems to be their main concern. The tires do generate grip, but the spray is big and they don't want to risk it, especially at a track like this where we've had so many unfortunate instances regarding visibility and collisions and honestly fatalities. So, yeah. I don't get it. So let's do the sprint. Piastri boxed early for inters. He came out in the lead after Max pit for inters. They really didn't stand a chance with those top speed differences that we saw. Let's talk quickly about Hamilton's penalty and his collision with Perez. Perez looked like he was falling back. He left the door open, and Hamilton was fully alongside of it on wet, tricky track conditions. He gets up on the curb and he runs wide and hits Perez in the side of the car. Was it malicious? Absolutely not. Was Hamilton taking advantage of an opportunity? Yes, you have to do that. If Hamilton didn't do that, I think a lot of people would have been disappointed. The fact that it resulted in a collision, and it seems to me like Hamilton got the 5-second penalty as a result of Perez DNFing the car, not as a result of the actual instance. So I don't know. People got all up in arms about that, but I feel like 5-second penalty for Hamilton was harsh. And this is coming from somebody that used to get paid by Red Bull. It was unfortunate for Perez, but he was going backwards before that happened. So yeah, I don't know. And a huge shout out to Pierre Gasly on that podium. That was super cool. Congrats to him. Very interesting. It's good that they sacked Otmar and their sporting director, so that that they can really get all the performance out of the car now. So yeah, I don't know what was up with Perez though, honestly, but I hope you guys have enjoyed this breakdown. If you're watching live on Twitch, we're going to go straight into the Grand Prix watch along now in just a minute. Don't forget to subscribe. If you're interested, check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. And I will see you after a little bit of a break, and we'll come back after the summer shutdown with some more videos on the main channel. We're going to do a technical breakdown of McLaren from the start of the season to now, showing you exactly where they've found performance and what that looks like. Yeah, I'll see you guys soon, and thanks again for 100,000 subscribers on Break F1.